October 6, 1941. Mtsensk, Soviet Union. Oberst Hermann Bauch, commanding the 2nd Panzer Regiment of Guderian's 4th Panzer Division, stood beside his burning Panzer III and watched something that shouldn't exist. The Soviet tank, hull-bound behind a low ridge 300 yards away, had just destroyed 4 German panzers in 90 seconds. Black's gunner had scored 3 direct hits on the Soviet machine with 50mm armor-piercing rounds. All 3 had ricocheted. The Soviet tank, seemingly undamaged, traversed its turret with mechanical precision and fired. The round struck Black's command tank in the turret face, penetrated completely, and detonated the ammunition storage. The Panzer III exploded, killing the crew instantly. Black, standing outside conferring with his company commanders, survived to watch the Soviet tank reverse down the slope and disappear into the forest. The tank was a T-34, Soviet designation T-34/76, model 1941. Weight 28 tons. Armor, sloped 45mm glacis plate, providing protection equivalent to 90mm vertical armor. Armament, 76.2mm F-34 gun, firing armor-piercing rounds at 2,150 feet per second, capable of penetrating 69mm of armor at 500 yards. Maximum speed, 34 miles per hour on roads, 15 miles per hour cross-country. Range, 250 miles. Crew, 4 men operating the most advanced medium tank in existence in 1941, and German intelligence had dismissed it as Soviet propaganda. The story begins not with combat on the Eastern Front, but with contempt in Berlin conference rooms, where Wehrmacht officers examined intelligence reports about Soviet tank production and concluded the Russians were incapable of designing modern armored vehicles. The assessment was based on observed Soviet industrial capacity, documented technological limitations, and systematic underestimation of an opponent Nazi racial ideology deemed subhuman. German intelligence knew about the T-34 before Operation Barbarossa began. Soviet forces had used small numbers of T-34s during the Winter War with Finland in 1939 to 1940. German military attachés in Moscow had photographed the tank during May Day parades in 1940 and 1941. Technical specifications, obtained through intelligence channels, reached the Abwehr and were forwarded to the Army High Command. The reports described a medium tank with unusually thick sloped armor, a powerful 76mm gun, wide tracks for mobility in mud and snow, and a diesel engine providing good range and reduced fire risk. The response was dismissal. German tank experts, analyzing the specifications, identified multiple design flaws that would render the T-34 ineffective in combat. The sloped armor, while theoretically providing enhanced protection, would be difficult to manufacture with Soviet industrial techniques and would create internal space problems. The 76mm gun was oversized for a medium tank, creating excessive weight and recoil stresses. The wide tracks would be complex to maintain and would limit maximum road speed. The diesel engine, unusual for a tank in 1941, would require specialized fuel logistics that Soviet supply systems couldn't manage. The overall design represented Soviet brute force engineering, crude, heavy, and impractical. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored doctrine and commander of Panzer Group II during Barbarossa, read the intelligence reports and concluded that German Panzer IIIs and IVs would dominate any Soviet tank they encountered. The Panzer III, equipped with a 50mm gun and 50mm frontal armor, represented mature German engineering, reliable, maneuverable, and combat-proven in France and North Africa. The Panzer IV, with its 75mm gun and similar armor, provided fire support, Together, these vehicles would overwhelm Soviet armor through superior tactics, training, and mechanical reliability. Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941. German panzer divisions, spearheading 3 massive army groups, advanced into Soviet territory expecting to encounter T-26s and BT-7 light tanks that German intelligence knew well. These Soviet vehicles, designed in the 1930s, were thinly armored, lightly armed, and vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons. The initial encounters confirmed expectations. Soviet tank brigades deploying T-26s and BT-7s in massed frontal assaults were annihilated by German anti-tank guns and panzers. By July 1941, German forces had destroyed over 6,000 Soviet tanks while suffering minimal losses. The campaign was proceeding exactly as planned. Then German units began encountering T-34s. The first engagement reports were filed by infantry units equipped with 37mm PaK-36 anti-tank guns, the standard German infantry anti-tank weapon. These guns, effective against Polish and French tanks in 1939 to 1940, were utterly ineffective against T-34 frontal armor. German gunners reported firing multiple rounds at approaching T-34s from ranges under 400 yards and watching the rounds ricochet without effect. The T-34s drove through defensive positions, crushing anti-tank guns under their tracks, machine gunning infantry, and destroying supply columns before retreating. Infantry commanders requested immediate reinforcement with heavier anti-tank weapons. Panzer units encountered T-34s next and reported similar problems. The Panzer III's 50mm gun could not penetrate the T-34's frontal armor at combat ranges. Side shots might penetrate if the range was under 300 yards and the angle favorable, but the T-34's sloped side armor deflected most hits. The Panzer IV's short-barreled 75mm gun, designed for infantry support rather than anti-tank work, was even less effective. German panzer commanders, trained to fight at ranges where their guns were effective, found themselves facing an opponent whose armor they couldn't penetrate, while the T-34's 76mm gun could destroy any German tank at 1,000 yards. The tactical problem was compounded by the T-34's mobility. German intelligence predicted that the wide tracks and heavy weight would limit cross-country performance. The opposite was true. The T-34's wide tracks distributed weight over a large surface area, reducing ground pressure and allowing the T-34 to traverse mud, snow, and soft ground where German panzers got stuck. The Christie suspension, copied from an American design that the U.S. Army had rejected, provided excellent cross-country speed and stability. The T-34 could move faster across Russian terrain than any German tank, allowing it to choose engagement ranges and break contact when outnumbered. German tank crews developed emergency procedures for engaging T-34s. Attack from the flanks or rear, where armor is thinner. Use the short-barreled 75mm gun on the Panzer IV to fire high-explosive rounds at the tracks, immobilizing the T-34 so it could be destroyed at close range. Call in 88mm anti-aircraft guns, the only German weapon that could reliably penetrate T-34 armor at range. Avoid frontal engagements entirely. These tactics worked, but they represented a fundamental reversal. German armor doctrine emphasized aggressive frontal assaults, leveraging superior firepower and protection. Against the T-34, German tanks were forced into defensive tactics, attempting to ambush an opponent they couldn't fight effectively in open combat. The mockery continued through late 1941 despite mounting evidence. German officers attributed the T-34's effectiveness to small numbers and poor Soviet crew training. The reports were undeniable. The T-34 had superior armor, superior armament, and superior mobility compared to any German tank. But German racial ideology and institutional arrogance prevented acceptance that the Soviets, deemed racially and culturally inferior, had designed a better tank. The T-34 was a crude vehicle operated by poorly trained crews. Once German forces adapted their tactics and brought up heavier weapons, the T-34 would prove no more effective than other Soviet equipment. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. Soviet tank production in 1941 exceeded German projections by a factor of 3. Despite catastrophic losses during the German advance, Soviet factories were producing over 1,000 T-34s per month by late 1941. The Germans had destroyed thousands of obsolete Soviet tanks, but the Soviets were replacing them with T-34s faster than German forces could destroy them. And T-34 crews, while initially poorly trained, were learning rapidly through combat experience. The German response was industrial rather than tactical. In November 1941, Guderian submitted a report to the Army High Command requesting immediate development of a new medium tank capable of matching the T-34. The specifications were straightforward: sloped armor providing protection equal to or better than the T-34, a high-velocity 75mm gun capable of penetrating T-34 armor at combat ranges, wide tracks for mobility, and a diesel engine for range and fire resistance. The report acknowledged, implicitly, that German tank design had been surpassed by Soviet engineering. Army High Command authorized development of what would become the Panther tank. But development, testing, and production would require 2 years. Meanwhile, German forces on the Eastern Front continued fighting with Panzer IIIs and IVs that couldn't effectively engage T-34s frontally. The solution was upgrading existing tanks with more powerful guns. The Panzer III received a longer 50mm gun. The Panzer IV received a long-barreled 75mm gun that could penetrate T-34 armor at reasonable ranges. These upgrades helped, but they were emergency measures, not solutions. The Battle of Moscow, December 1941, demonstrated what massed T-34 formations could achieve. Soviet tank brigades, equipped primarily with T-34s and supported by infantry, counterattacked German forces that had advanced to within 20 miles of Moscow. The German panzers, immobilized by cold weather and fuel shortages, were overrun. T-34s, whose diesel engines were more reliable in extreme cold than German gasoline engines, drove through German positions, destroying supply columns and artillery positions. The German advance stalled, then reversed. By January 1942, German forces had been pushed back over 100 miles. German tankers recognized that they were fighting an opponent whose equipment was superior to their own. This recognition spread slowly through the Wehrmacht as more units encountered T-34s. The mockery stopped. Intelligence reports now described the T-34 as the most dangerous Soviet tank, superior to any current German tank in armor and armament, and capable of dominating the battlefield when properly employed. These assessments reached Hitler, who demanded immediate action to match Soviet tank technology. The industrial response was massive. German tank production increased throughout 1942, but so did Soviet production. By mid-1942, Soviet factories were producing over 1,300 T-34s per month by late 1941. The Germans had destroyed thousands of obsolete Soviet tanks, but the Soviets were replacing them with T-34s faster than German forces could destroy them. And T-34 crews, while initially poorly trained, were learning rapidly through combat experience. The T-34's design philosophy represented a fundamental challenge to German engineering culture. German tanks were precision instruments, manufactured to exacting tolerances with high-quality components. This approach produced excellent vehicles, but limited production numbers and made field repair difficult. The T-34 was designed for mass production and field maintenance. Tolerances were loose, components were interchangeable. Repairs could be completed with basic tools with crews with minimal training. The tank was crude by German standards, but it was available in overwhelming numbers and kept fighting despite damage that would disable a German panzer. Soviet production techniques horrified German engineers who examined captured T-34s. Welds were rough. Armor plates showed visible casting flaws. The transmission was simple but prone to failure. The commander doubled as gunner, creating command and control problems. The visibility from inside the tank was terrible, with periscopes that provided narrow fields of view. The interior was cramped, with minimal crew comfort. By German standards, the T-34 was a poorly manufactured vehicle with multiple design compromises. But it worked. The rough welds didn't matter because the sloped armor deflected most hits regardless of surface finish. The casting flaws didn't matter because Soviet metallurgy produced armor that was, if anything, harder than specification due to high carbon content. The transmission failures were addressed by carrying spare transmissions that could be swapped in the field within hours. The commander-gunner issue was solved by aggressive tactics that minimized the need for complex coordination. The visibility was compensated for by aggressive reconnaissance and a willingness to accept losses. Every design compromise enabled faster production, simpler logistics, or easier field maintenance. The Germans couldn't match this approach. German industrial culture prioritized quality over quantity, precision over expedience. Attempts to simplify German tank designs and increase production met resistance from designers who refused to compromise engineering standards. The result was that German tank production remained constrained, while Soviet production accelerated. By 1943, the Soviet Union was producing over 2,000 T-34s per month. Germany was producing approximately 1,500 tanks of all types per month, and most of those were assigned to multiple fronts, not just the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kursk, July 1943, represented the peak of German armored power and the beginning of its permanent decline. German forces committed over 2,700 tanks and assault guns, including the new Panther and Tiger tanks designed to counter the T-34. Soviet forces defending prepared positions deployed over 5,000 tanks, primarily T-34s. The battle lasted 2 weeks and ended in German defeat. The Wehrmacht lost approximately 760 tanks, many of them irreplaceable Panthers and Tigers. Soviet forces lost over 1,800 tanks, primarily T-34s, but replaced those losses within weeks. The arithmetic was decisive. German forces could win tactical engagements, destroying more Soviet tanks than they lost, but a strategic victory required destroying Soviet armor faster than it could be replaced. This was impossible. Soviet tank production exceeded German production by 3-to-1. Soviet willingness to accept casualties exceeded German tolerance. Soviet operational depth meant that even catastrophic defeats didn't threaten Soviet industrial capacity or manpower reserves. Germany was fighting a war of attrition against an opponent with functionally unlimited resources. The T-34's dominance extended beyond simple numbers. The tank's design influenced German development programs, forcing the Wehrmacht to abandon pre-war doctrine and adopt Soviet principles. The Panther tank, entering service in 1943, copied the T-34's sloped armor, wide tracks, and emphasis on mobility. The design was better than the T-34 in most measurable categories: thicker armor, more powerful gun, better optics, and more sophisticated suspension. But it was also more complex, more expensive, and more difficult to maintain. Panthers required specialized maintenance that front-line units couldn't provide. They suffered chronic reliability problems, particularly with the transmission and final drives. They were available in small numbers, typically fewer than 50 per Panzer division, compared to hundreds of T-34s per Soviet tank corps. German tank crews who had mocked the T-34 in 1941 were dead by 1943, replaced by crews who respected Soviet armor and understood that survival depended on avoiding fair fights. The tactical doctrine evolved to emphasize defensive operations from prepared positions, using superior German optics and crew training to engage Soviet tanks at maximum range before T-34 numbers could overwhelm defensive positions. This worked when terrain and circumstances favored defense, but it represented the complete abandonment of the aggressive mobile warfare that had characterized German operations in 1939–1941. Soviet crews, meanwhile, were becoming veterans. The poorly trained conscripts of 1941 were gone, killed during the catastrophic retreats of that year. The crews operating T-34s in 1943–1944 had survived multiple engagements, understood their vehicles' strengths and limitations, and executed tactics that leveraged numerical superiority and operational depth. Soviet armored doctrine emphasized breakthrough operations using massed tank formations that overwhelmed German defensive positions through sheer weight of numbers. Individual T-34s might be destroyed in large numbers, but enough survived to penetrate German lines and rampage through rear areas, destroying supplies, artillery, and command posts. The ultimate humiliation came not from technical superiority, but from production capacity. By 1944, the Soviet Union was producing T-34s faster than Germany could produce ammunition to destroy them. German anti-tank units, calculating expenditure rates, determined that destroying a single T-34 required an average of 4 anti-tank gun rounds or 3 tank gun rounds, accounting for misses and armor deflections. With Soviet tank production exceeding 2,000 vehicles per month, German forces needed to fire over 8,000 anti-tank rounds per month just to maintain parity. German ammunition production couldn't support these expenditure rates. The Wehrmacht was quite literally running out of bullets fast enough to kill the tanks they faced. The T-34's evolution continued through the war. The T-34-85, introduced in 1944, mounted an 85mm gun in a larger 3-man turret, solving the commander-gunner problem and providing a weapon that could engage German heavy tanks effectively. The new model retained the T-34's mobility, reliability, and ease of production while addressing its most significant tactical limitation. Production transitioned to the T-34-85 without disrupting output. By mid-1944, Soviet factories were producing over 1,200 T-34-85s per month, maintaining numerical superiority while matching German tanks in firepower. German generals, the ones who had laughed at T-34 intelligence reports in 1941, stopped discussing tank versus tank combat by 1944. The tactical situation had evolved beyond questions of which tank was better. German forces lacked fuel, ammunition, replacement vehicles, and trained crews. Soviet forces had all of these in overwhelming quantities. Individual German tanks might be superior in one-on-one combat, but such combat rarely occurred. Soviet tactics emphasized massed assaults using dozens or hundreds of tanks against German positions defended by handfuls of panzers. The outcome was predetermined by arithmetic. The final operations of the war saw Soviet tank armies, equipped primarily with T-34-85s, advancing across Eastern Europe and into Germany itself. German panzer divisions, reduced to shadows of their 1941 strength, could delay but not stop these advances. The T-34, crude and simple by German standards, had become the symbol of Soviet military power and the instrument of Germany's destruction. The tank that German intelligence had dismissed as propaganda in 1940 crushed German cities in 1945. Post-war analysis revealed that the Soviet Union produced approximately 84,000 T-34s between 1940 and 1945, more than any other tank in history. German production of all tank types combined totaled approximately 24,000 vehicles over the same period. The numerical disparity was even more pronounced when accounting for losses. German factories couldn't replace destroyed tanks at rates sufficient to maintain force strength, while Soviet production exceeded losses by wide margins, allowing Soviet armored forces to grow continuously throughout the war. The T-34's influence extended beyond World War II. The tank remained in production until 1958, with over 100,000 built, including post-war variants. It served in over 40 armies and participated in conflicts from Korea to the Middle East to Africa. The design principles it embodied, sloped armor, powerful armament, wide tracks, diesel engines, and emphasis on producibility, influenced every subsequent tank design. Modern main battle tanks, from the American M1 Abrams to the Russian T-90, trace their lineage directly to the T-34's innovations. The Germans learned the lesson too late. The Panther and Tiger tanks, developed in response to the T-34, were excellent vehicles by technical measures, but couldn't be produced in sufficient numbers to affect strategic outcomes. German industry, despite operating with slave labor and prioritizing military production above all else, couldn't match Soviet output. The engineering excellence that produced the Panther came at the cost of production bottlenecks, maintenance nightmares, and strategic irrelevance. The side that won wasn't the side with the best tank, it was the side that built enough tanks to overwhelm the opposition through sheer numbers. Hermann Balck, who watched his command tank explode at Motsensk in October 1941, survived the war and wrote extensively about the Eastern Front. His memoirs acknowledged that German forces had fundamentally misunderstood Soviet capabilities and that the T-34 represented a wake-up call German leadership had ignored. By the time German industry responded with the Panther, the opportunity to achieve strategic victory had passed. The war had become an attrition struggle that Germany couldn't win. The mockery that characterized German attitudes towards Soviet equipment in 1941 was replaced by grim respect by 1943 and outright fear by 1945. The T-34, crude and simple by German standards, had proven more effective in actual combat than the precision German panzers it faced. This wasn't because the T-34 was technically superior in every category. German tanks had better optics, more reliable transmissions, and more comfortable crew stations, but the T-34 was superior in the categories that mattered: armor protection, firepower, mobility, producibility, and maintainability. These advantages, combined with the Soviet willingness to accept casualties and the Soviet industrial capacity to sustain production, made the T-34 the decisive land warfare weapon of World War II. The death ray never worked because physics forbade it. The B-17 succeeded through mass production and survivability. Kulin's hedgerow cutter solved an immediate problem through improvisation. Lamar's frequency hopping enabled future technologies. The T-34 won through the brutal simplicity of being good enough and available in overwhelming numbers. The crude tank, the unstoppable tank, the tank that German intelligence dismissed as propaganda, crushed the Wehrmacht through attrition that German industry couldn't match and tactics that German doctrine couldn't counter. 79 years after Black watched his Panzer explode under T-34 fire, military analysts studying armored warfare still point to the T-34 as the example of effective design. Not the best tank in any single category, but the best tank for the war it actually fought. Fast enough to exploit breakthroughs, tough enough to survive battlefield conditions, simple enough to build in massive numbers, crude enough that field repairs kept it fighting, and available in numbers that made German victory arithmetically impossible, regardless of tactical or operational skill. The generals stopped laughing in 1941 when the T-34 first appeared. By 1943, they stopped discussing how to counter it. By 1945, they were silent, watching Soviet tank armies roll into Berlin, T-34s crushing the remnants of German resistance under tracks that German intelligence had once claimed were too wide to be practical. The flying brick destroyed the Luftwaffe, the crude Soviet tank destroyed the Wehrmacht, and the lesson was the same. Wars are won by weapons that work well enough and exist in numbers sufficient to overwhelm the opposition, not by precision instruments available in quantities too small to matter. The T-34 crushed the Panzer divisions not because it was perfect, but because it was good enough, and there were tens of thousands of them. German generals learned this lesson after their armies had been destroyed. The laughter ended somewhere on the frozen plains of Russia in 1941, replaced by the sound of diesel engines and the crash of 76mm guns, then silence as Soviet armor rolled over German positions and continued west, unstoppable, inevitable, and crude enough that it kept working when everything else had failed.